Hello and welcome to BYJU'S Exam Prep IAS. Let's begin today's session of comprehensive news analysis with the first article that we have that talks about the Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of Crime on Genocide of 1948. The author here says that in the light of the recent Dharm Sansad that was held in Haridwar, India must make efforts to bring in a domestic law to help prevent genocides and punish people those who are responsible for it. The author says that in the past few years, India has witnessed a lot of hate speeches being given on multiple platforms, but not a lot of effective action has been taken against them. Although India, as a party to the Convention on Prevention and Punishment of Crime of Genocide of 1948, is obliged to take action against such incidents and obliged to stop them from happening, but sadly, we don't see any such law in the country. Ironically, this convention was introduced when India, along with Cuba and Panama, co-sponsored it in 1946 in the UN General Assembly. The convention affirmed genocide as a crime under international law. Right now, over 150 states are a party to it and have ratified it, including India. The main objective of the convention is prevention of genocide as well as punishing it as a crime within the nation. Now, this convention puts in multiple legal obligations on the nations that have ratified it. For example, Article 1 says the country must not commit genocide, must prevent genocide, and must punish genocide in all forms. Article 5 says there must be a legislation to give effect to provisions of this convention in the domestic law, which India has not done so far. Article 5 also says that government must provide effective penalties for those who are found guilty of criminal conduct. The government must also try those people who are charged with genocide in a competent tribunal. Again, Article 6 has not been realized in the country as per the author here. The author says that despite being the country behind the passing of this resolution in the UN, India has not enacted this legislation which gives effect to Article number 6. The IPC provisions, that is the Indian Penal Code that we have in the country, talks about punishments for rioting, for unlawful assembly, for promoting enmity between different groups, but these do not equate to the concept of genocide, since genocide refers to conditions in which such hate speech and associated acts are not allowed to flourish, which may facilitate the commission of genocide. Now, this convention has been invoked multiple times in the international institutions. The most recent one was the case of the Republic of Gambia going to the International Court of Justice against Myanmar for its failure to safeguard the Rohingya lives within the country. Now, this was a pretty interesting case for multiple reasons. Number one, Gambia is nowhere near Myanmar and is not directly impacted by what is happening to the Rohingyas. But Gambia still went ahead and filed a case in the International Court of Justice. And thus, everyone in the international community was very interested to know whether or not the court will accept the case. Interestingly, the International Court of Justice did accept the case, and in the first ruling said that even an outside state that is not related to the issue directly can come to the ICJ if they feel that this particular convention is being overlooked by a party that has already ratified it. And under this, Gambia went to the International Court of Justice against Myanmar and its treatment of the Rohingyas. The ICJ, in fact, had allowed the same earlier as well in the old case of 2007 of Belgium versus Senegal. Now, there are a couple of questions here. Number one, has the Indian judiciary asked the government to make a law about this or not? And the second question is, why did Gambia go to the International Court of Justice and no other authority? Let's go beyond the write-up to understand these 2 points. First, yes, the Indian judiciary has talked about the concept of genocide and the need for this term to be defined in our law with an attached punishment to it. In 2018, Justice S. Muralidhar of Delhi High Court, while hearing a judgment in the State versus Sajjan Kumar case, the person who was accused of the Sikh riots in 1984, the judge said that neither crimes against humanity nor genocide has been made part of India's criminal law. It is a lacuna that needs to be addressed urgently. However, no action has been taken in this regard. Although nations like India may not have defined the concept of genocide, the definition of the crime of genocide has been set out in the Rome Statute that led to the establishment of the International Criminal Court. The Rome Statute establishes four core international crimes, including genocide, crimes against humanity, war crimes, and crime of aggression. Now, the question, why is it that Gambia went to International Court of Justice and not any other place, is because this convention mentions that if any party wants to file a case, if this convention has not been followed, the place where they can go and appeal is the International Court of Justice. The nations that are parties to the International Court of Justice are liable to accept the decision given by the International Court of Justice. Now, what exactly was the matter of Myanmar versus Gambia, and where does the International Court of Justice sit in? As I said, the International Court of Justice is hearing a matter of Myanmar versus Gambia, where Gambia was a party that filed a case on the basis that the Rohingya population of Myanmar is not being protected by the state and are being subjected to genocide. Now, such cases take a long time for the final judgment to come in, and in this case also the final judgment has not come in so far. However, the court has given a provisional judgment under which the government of Myanmar has been asked to take effective measures to protect the Rohingya Muslims and protect the evidence relating to the allegations of genocide as well. It was in November 2019 that Gambia went to the ICJ against Myanmar over these violations and urged the court to direct Myanmar to stop genocide and ensure that people who are committing genocide are also punished. Both Gambia and Myanmar are parties to this convention, and Article 9 of this 1948 convention allows one party to move to the ICJ against the others, as we just discussed. Now, what is the stand of Myanmar? Myanmar approached the court saying that the case should be quashed for multiple reasons. Number one, Myanmar said that Gambia has not filed the case for itself, but rather they have filed the case as a proxy on behalf of the Organization of Islamic Cooperation, which is true. The OIC is a group of Muslim majority nations and has Gambia also as one of the members. However, the court said that this is no reason to reject this plea, and even if they have filed it on behalf of someone else, the fact is that the allegations that they have put in do seem to be true prima facie. Now, what is the implication of such a ruling by the ICJ? If the ruling goes against Myanmar, which the provisional ruling has done, it will dent the image of Myanmar internationally, and as per the law, the provisional orders must be followed by the states who are party to this convention. However, if you look at the history of International Court of Justice, most of the decisions given by the court are not really followed by the party word by word. As per the law, the responsibility of ensuring that the decisions of the International Court of Justice are followed is on the Security Council. So basically, it is the P5 nations that have to ensure that if a nation is not following the judgment given by the ICJ, they have to put sanctions and kind of force the nation to accept the judgment. However, in the past, we have seen that when the ICJ gives a judgment against a P5 nation itself, no one says anything. For example, there was a case of Nicaragua versus the USA, where the judgment came against USA, but as expected, Americans did not even pay attention to what the court was saying. Similar was the case when the ICJ gave a judgment in favor of Philippines against China when it comes to the South China Sea and its territory, but again China refused to accept the judgment. So when it comes to the P5 members, at least nothing that the ICJ says holds any relevance because they are the ones who have to get that implemented. Thus, that also needs to be changed. The next article that we have is based on an extremely complicated issue which has been in the news for a very long time now and unfortunately has now involved an Indian life as well. It was in the news recently because of a drone attack that took place in Abu Dhabi, that is the capital of the UAE, by the Houthi rebels of Yemen. In that drone attack, apparently 3 people lost their lives. Of these 3, 2 were Indians and there was a Pakistani citizen as well who lost his life. Now, it's an extremely complex issue about what is happening in Yemen and who are the groups who are involved here. Why is Saudi Arabia fighting the Houthis? Why are the Houthi rebels attacking UAE? So we'll try and simplify it for you, but I want your complete attention if you want to understand the basics of this issue. So I will come back to this slide, but let me just give you a very brief background. This is Yemen's map. If you actually see, Yemen shares a large boundary with Saudi Arabia, but does not share a boundary with the UAE. So UAE is slightly different. Yemen is at a slightly different place geographically. Also, you see that the geographic location of Yemen is extremely significant. It borders both the Red Sea and the Arabian Sea. So it is on the way of an extremely important choke point here, which can block the trade from Europe to Asia. That is why, if you know, China has invested a lot and has set up a major naval base here at Djibouti so that this area can be under their control. Now let's start with the very basics. So the basics are that the Muslim world is mainly divided into two sects, that is Shias and Sunnis. Saudi Arabia considers itself as the leader of all the Sunni Muslims around the world, while the same is the case with Iran. Iran has a majority Shia population and it considers itself as a savior and the head of the Shia population throughout the world. Now, also understand that Houthis are a Shia group. Since they are a Shia group, they would obviously be supported by Iran. Saudi and Iran, on the other hand, have a great rivalry for a very, very long time. It's kind of a Cold War rivalry that we used to have between the US and the USSR. Like they did not fight face to face, they did not have any direct wars, but they indirectly fought in Vietnam, they indirectly fought in Afghanistan also. Similar is the case here. Iran and Saudi Arabia don't go well with each other, they hate each other, they are pretty strict enemies. However, rather than fighting face to face, they fight proxy wars. So Houthi is a rebel group in Yemen. Rebel group means a group that wants to displace the government and wants to rule over the country. Since they are Shia Muslims, they are supported by Iran. Saudi Arabia does not like Iran. Also, Saudi Arabia does not want a country in its own neighborhood that is ruled by a Shia group. So obviously, Saudi Arabia will attack the Houthis and will attack Yemen. Saudi Arabia, on the other hand, is in favor of the Yemen government. The Yemen government, who is headed by president whose name is Mr. Hadi. So do remember these basics. Yemen government, led by Mr. Hadi, is supported by Saudi Arabia. This government is being fought by the Houthi group. They want to displace the government. Who are they? They are Shia Muslims and they are supported by Iran. Now, the entire world is interested in this because of this location of Yemen, which is strategically extremely important for the trade route between Asia and Europe. Now, let's go back and see the problem that originated. Now, let's go back and see the origin of this problem and try and understand this one by one. So, the recent occurrence is that there was a drone attack by the Saudi rebels in UAE. Not Saudi Arabia, but UAE. And we'll come to that. How did the UAE also get involved here? Saudi obviously were unhappy. So they said, okay, for your drone attack, we will also retaliate. Our revenge will be that we will put rockets in Yemen. So Saudi Arabia, as they have been doing for many years, fired some rockets in Yemen and about 15 people were killed, which is very common and unfortunate. But this is what has been happening for many years now. Now, the Houthi movement is a pretty old movement in Yemen. Houthi means believing youth. So the youth that believes in the God, that believes in Almighty. They belong to a clan in Islam called the Zaidi clan. They are the Zaidi revivalist group and the group was founded by Hussein al-Houthi. It is on his name that the Houthi group has been named. Now, as I said, the Zaidis of Yemen, whose group is named Houthis, are Shia Muslims, but they practice a slightly different form of Shia Islam as compared to Iran and Iraq. However, they are still supported by Iran no matter what. These Zaidis of the Houthi group make up 1/3 of Yemen's population. The remaining 2/3 population of Yemen belongs to Sunni Muslims. Now, although the Zaidis have never been in majority in Yemen, but if you look at the history of Yemen, the Zaidis have ruled over Yemen for over 1000 years before they were displaced by the Ottoman Empire. This Ottoman Empire declined after the First World War, that is in 1918, and then Zaidis came back to power and established a monarchy. This monarchy ran till 1962 when Egypt interfered here and they supported people who wanted to overthrow the monarchy. The Houthis were unhappy with this, so they wanted to consolidate their Zaidi minority again so that they can again come back to power. They started raising slogans against the government. The government at that time was run by President Saleh, who was in support of the US. When the government was fed up of these protests in 2004, the government issued arrest warrant against the Houthi leader, and later on the leader was killed by the government forces. That again led to a lot of violence in the country between the government and the Houthi groups. So much so that by 2010, Houthis had become so powerful that they had captured the province of Sada from the government troops. Sada, as you can see on the map, is in the northern part of Yemen. So this is Sada. So north part of Yemen, basically right now, if you see, is under the control of the Houthis. But Houthis wanted the entire country, not just the northern part. So in 2011, when the Arab Spring started, Arab Spring was a series of protests in the Arab countries by the people demanding democracy in their countries and removal of the monarchies that had been established in most of the countries. Due to Arab Spring, a lot of emperors had to resign in the Arab world. In Yemen also, Houthis wanted the president to resign, so they supported the Arab Spring and they put pressure on President Saleh to resign. And thus he resigned in November. And this is when a new president came to power, that is Mr. Hadi, who is supported by Saudi Arabia. Why? Because he is a Sunni Muslim. When the new president came to power, that is Mr. Hadi, he first thought of having peace talks with the Houthis to pacify the situation, but the peace talks broke down. Why? Because the new president, Mr. Hadi, decided to divide that part of Yemen which is dominated by the Zaidis. Zaidis, who are the people behind the Houthi group, did not like it and the peace talks broke down. Now, to be true, the version of history that I am telling you is a very compressed version. There are thousands of other factors involved. It's a long history of that region, and you don't need to remember the entire history word by word and incident by incident. But you just need to understand the framework of why the two sides are fighting, which side is supporting whom, and where does India stand, which I tried to explain to you in the very beginning. Now, Saudi Arabia, as I said, sees the Houthis as the proxies for Iran, that they are fighting with the support of Iran, although Iran denies it. Thus, Saudi Arabia has been conducting airstrikes for a very long time without putting any soldiers on the ground. Houthis, on the other hand, are not really worried about it. They have already established their government in the north part of Yemen. International community says that Saudi bombings has led to the killing of large number of civilian deaths, while the Houthis, on the other hand, intentionally set up their offices at places where it is very densely populated so that Saudi Arabia thinks twice before sending any rockets. Now, in this entire story, the question was, why did the Houthis attack the UAE? Where does UAE come in? Now, UAE is seen as a partner of Saudi Arabia. In fact, in the recent times, a new group has emerged in Yemen. That group is called the Giant Brigades. Giant Brigade is a group that has been set up in southern Yemen. So if you actually see the map of Yemen, this is the place. If you look at Yemen, the northern part of Yemen, this is the place that is under the control of the Houthis right now. A new group has emerged in the southern part of Yemen that wants to take over control of the Houthi. This group is called the Giant Brigades. This Giant Brigade group is the one that is supported by the UAE. Apart from this, one other group has emerged called the Joint Forces. This group is run by the nephew of President Saleh. Remember, the president that was forced to step down because of the Houthis in the Arab Spring. That is why Houthis don't like the interference of UAE in their country. The Houthis are saying that UAE must remain far from this because they are not involved in this conflict, and attacking the UAE with a drone was a stern warning to them. Now, the reason why this is bad news for UAE is, see, they are a pretty powerful country. They have a lot of money, so they can easily handle these threats. But if you look at UAE, they have worked very hard to establish their international image of a peaceful destination for investment throughout the world. People go to Dubai, people go to UAE for investment. In fact, the IPL was held in UAE because we thought that it is much safer as compared to India in terms of how they are handling coronavirus. So now, when the world sees that a drone attack can take place even in UAE and can kill 3 people, the image of UAE as an investment hub will take a beating, and that is what Houthis are aiming for. As I said earlier, if you don't understand the entire history of how this conflict started and where it is going, don't worry, you don't need to go into so much detail. As long as you understand the framework of what are the two sides, why are they opposed to each other, and what is the issue right now, where exactly is the rebel group, and where exactly is the Saudi group, you are good to go and you don't need to worry much more about it. The next article that we have is a controversy that has emerged over a proposed steel plant in the state of Odisha. Now, this might seem like deja vu because steel plant in Odisha and people protesting against it is not a new story. Exactly the same thing had happened when the major South Korean company POSCO was trying to establish a steel plant in Odisha. That is, they had announced that they will invest over 50,000 crore rupees for the steel plant, but because of a lot of protests and the failure to acquire the needed land, POSCO project had to be closed down in the country. And the same story is being repeated again. So the story is that in Odisha's Jagat Singhpur district, the administration had to use armed personnel to demolish beetle vineyards and clear 3,000 acres of land in order to establish a mega steel project of Jindal Steelworks. The villagers in the district are opposing it. As I said, the same thing had happened earlier in 2005. The Odisha government had signed a memorandum of understanding with POSCO for setting up their steel plant with an investment of 52,000 crore rupees. That was India's single biggest FDI investment till date. But the villagers opposed it. Why? As per the villagers, the betel leaf farming is lucrative. Betel leaf, as you know, is the leaf that is used to make pan. The pan that you eat, actually, that leaf is called the betel leaf. Farmers also undertake activities such as fishing and paddy cultivation on this area, and they fear that their livelihood will be hurt. Now, when such a land acquisition takes place, farmers or the people who own that land are given compensation or, in many cases, jobs also. But their past experiences have told the farmers that this process is a very long process and it might not be very easy to get the promised amount of money from the government or from the companies. That is why, with the help of a number of NGOs and activists, these farmers are protesting against this project. In case of POSCO, the company had even reduced the requirement for the land, but still the resistance for the land acquisition continued and the farmers did not allow the required land to be acquired by the government for the company. Although the government did manage to acquire about 2,700 acres of land for POSCO, the company eventually could not get a license for captive iron ore mining and had to shut down the project. This 2,700 acres of land that was already acquired by the Odisha government was then converted into a land bank. Means in the future, whenever a company comes for requirement of land, we will give it to them automatically without any delay because we have already acquired it from the people. And now comes the Jindal Steelworks. Jindal Steelwork also had a similar proposal of setting up a steel plant in the state. The state government decided to give 2,900 acres of land to the company, out of which 2,700 acres they already had, so they only had to have 200 acres more. But the Jindal Group revised their project and said that we now need more land because we are increasing the size of the factory and we will also set up a power plant and cement grinding mixing. And thus the government now needed to look for more land to accommodate all the new projects that the Jindal company required. The total requirement of Jindal now with the revised projection is 2,950 acres of land. Out of these 2,950 acres that the Jindal company requires, about 45 acres comes in a village called Dhinkia. And now this Dhinkia village is the one where most of the problem starts. Even at the time of the POSCO project and today, most of the protests against the government and against the project is by the villagers living in this village of Dhinkia. They only have 45 acres of land out of the entire land that the government requires. Now the interesting part is that even this 45 acres of land is not their private land. This is a government land only. But on this land, the residents of Dhinkia undertake beetle vineyard farming, and thus they don't want to let it go, and that is why they are sitting in protest. Government, on the other hand, is trying to demolish these vineyards so that when there are no more vineyards left, the people would anyways have no option but to leave it. But this one single village and its villagers are not allowing this multi-billion-dollar company to go ahead with its projects. Activists have also sided with the villagers, saying that the proposed project does not have the required environmental clearances. The company is still waiting for the clearance. Then how can the government go ahead with the land acquisition? There is a concept of environmental impact assessment that has to be prepared by the company to give it to the government to prove that we are not harming the environment while creating this project. The company, on the other hand, says that we have prepared a rehabilitation package and we will give much more money to the people as compared to what the government policy tells us. If the government policy says us to give 5,000 rupees to villagers, in that place we will give them much more than 5,000 rupees. In fact, the company has also offered jobs to the locals, but again, the local people are not trusting the company because their experience with such kind of policies has not been very positive. The district administration has started constructing a boundary wall for the steel project in the area that has already been acquired, and once the wall is complete, the villagers won't be able to access the land that they are using for their livelihood. Thus, there is a need for multiple stakeholders to get together: the government, the villagers, the Gram Sabha, and the company that is involved here to arrive at an amicable solution before the things get out of hand here. Now, we discussed in very brief about the concept of environmental impact assessment. Let's see what this is and how does it work. So the United Nations Environment Program says that environmental impact assessment is a tool to identify the environmental, social, and economic impact of a project before the decision is taken. So for example, if you are setting up a steel plant and you require, let's assume, 2,000 acres of land, this would lead to cutting down of, let's say, 2 lakh trees. This would also lead to about thousands of people leaving their land, being displaced. There will be a lot of construction activities going on. So how much harm would the environment take, and how much harm would the people's livelihood take, and would it be compensated by the company or not? This is what is environmental impact assessment. It's a report that has to be made before the project is given permission by the government. It aims to predict the environmental impact at an early stage so that decisions can be taken keeping all the other aspects in mind. In India specifically, the first mention of EIA goes back to 1976, when the Planning Commission asked the Department of Science and Technology to examine the River Valley project from an environmental angle. The first government notification came up in 1994 by the Ministry of Environment and Forest. Now, the EIA is a part of Environment Protection Act 1986, and there are 2 categories of projects under the law: Category A and Category B. One category of projects are those that don't require mandatory environmental impact assessment before permission is being given, while the other category requires the company to undertake this assessment and submit it to the government in order to get permissions from the government. In 2020, in fact, the environmental impact assessment laws were changed, making it easier for the companies to get permission from the government and making it difficult for the environmentalists and activists to appeal against that. The problem here is that the government has to strike a fine balance between improving the ease of business in India by allowing quick permissions and ensuring that the sanity of environment also is maintained throughout the country. In that view, the recent changes in EIA have some issues as per the experts. For example, the latest law says that for strategic projects, clearance will be given much easily, although there is no proper definition of strategic projects. The time to appeal against a certain project has been reduced to ensure that the construction activities and the project goes on at a higher speed. And the activists also say that India's environmental impact assessment is not as rigorous as the international frameworks and convention, and we must relook into it. The next article here is written by a former director of NCERT, that is Mr. Krishna Kumar. He says that in order to ensure that the schools in India, especially the schools in the village areas, realize their true potential, we have to give them much more autonomy and much more freedom to work in a manner that they want. Right now, schools have to follow the directives that are given from the bureaucracy, where not the educationists but administrators are sitting. So an IAS officer, for example, decides when would the school open, when would the school close down, what would be the curriculum followed, and this is given to the schools and they have to follow it up without any respect given to the educationists, the teachers, and the principals who are sitting in the school. The decision making is not in their hands, rather, it is in the hands of the bureaucrats. And until this model remains in India, it would be very difficult to see any progress in the school. Recently, the World Bank's Global Education Director said that there is absolutely no justification for keeping the schools closed during the pandemic. There is no science that proves that you have to wait for all the children to get vaccinated before reopening of schools. In India, only the closing down of schools for such a long time due to the COVID pandemic has led to an enormous loss of learning. In India, learning poverty is expected to increase from 55 to 70% due to the learning loss. You might argue that the classes have been taken online, but for schools and the students where they can't afford this infrastructure and internet availability is low, this method of learning has created a major gap between their goals and where they stand right now. It has also increased the number of students who are out of school, with many parents not being able to afford to pay a fee for the students. The article points out that the bureaucracy views the school functionaries with suspicion. They don't believe that the teachers and other people who are working in the school or in the field of education would take good decisions. And that is why, no matter how senior you are in the school, no matter for how many years you're working in the school, your job will only be to follow the orders and the circulars given to you by the directorate. For example, when would the schools close? When would the schools open? How will the classes be conducted? Would you be getting online classes or not? All these are based on the orders given by the directorates and the administrators, and not by the school teachers and the school staff. This is what happens in the government schools. Almost exactly the same thing is happening in the private schools, just that in the private schools, these orders are given by the owners of the school or the school managers. But it is not the educationists or the teachers who are in the classrooms who are allowed to decide how the school will run. And that is a major problem in the running of the schools in India. Most of the activities in the school are centralized. There is one single decision making authority that will tell in the entire state or the country about how the schools will run, what curriculum would they follow, and what board would they have to get accredited with. This one size fits all approach will never work when it comes to education and schools. The impact of COVID has been very different in different areas, but we have not given a lot of attention to the schools in villages. Yes, we have been focused on job losses, on the stress on the farmers, on healthcare, but somehow in our national debate, education, especially education in villages, has taken a backseat. The author here gives an example of how allowing freedom to the schools would have been different. Since the schools have been closed, the midday meals, which were cooked meals, have been replaced in many states by distribution of raw grains and money so that the children or the parents could arrange the meal themselves. Now, if village schools would have been allowed certain autonomy or freedom to choose, in many villages it would have been possible to find a place where this food can be cooked and children can be allowed to come for cooked meals. They could even come and spend some time studying in a different kind of an environment, because villages have a lot of open spaces. Villages have a different kind of a social framework, and there you can gather people at a much wider place. But because one single directive was given from the top that the schools will be closed, we did not allow the villages to explore other options. The schools are not even allowed to take decisions about the daily time span, the class size, or how the teaching would go on. And thus, our schools, especially the government schools, are far from realizing their true potential. We all understand the fact that the focus must be on foundational literacy and numeracy, especially in the young age of a student's life. However, online teaching cannot compensate for that. There are multiple studies that have suggested that children need opportunities to observe natural phenomena and analyze it. The children will learn much more from actually seeing a plant or a tree grow, from seeing how a bird flies, from seeing how someone runs, from seeing how an animal behaves. This could be done much better in village schools since the students there would be much more connected with nature and the surroundings would be much more open. But again, the village schools were not allowed that option. In fact, contrary to the assumption, the teachers in the villages can bring great energy into their teaching by encouraging the students to spend more time outdoors and observe things. This will not only help them in becoming much more aware, but even the skills of mathematics such as numeracy, counting, etc. can be learned best when you're excited about it and you're actually counting something that you're interested in rather than being forced to remember tables from the books that you have no interest in. Now, since we are talking about the issue of autonomy to the schools, let me bring in one more point of view here so that you understand the problems that we have in the schools. We have an ASER report. ASER stands for Annual Status of Education Report. It is published by an NGO called Pratham. Although it is published by an NGO, the government also takes it very seriously and uses these numbers to frame their education policy. So the ASER report is the one that tells you how many students in class 5 can read their text, or when you see the news that class 8 students cannot solve a mathematical sum of class 3 or class 4, all those numbers actually come in the ASER. This is considered as one of the most credible sources of data of education in India. The report says that in some states, less than 10% teachers pass the teacher eligibility test. Government schools are very rare, and that is why parents are compelled to send their children to private schools. Now, obviously, the population of the children will increase, and when most of them want to go to private schools, meaning that you would want more private schools in the country. In fact, from 2011 to 2015, enrollment in government schools fell down by 1.1 crore, and in private schools, it increased by 1.6 crore. This is all government data. Means there is a need to have more private schools. However, in reality, not many private schools are opening for many reasons. First reason is it is extremely difficult for an honest person to actually start a school with the number of permissions required being so high depending on state to state. Not just this, school in India is a not-profit business. So if you are running a school, as per the law, you cannot officially have any profit. For example, if you are earning fees of rupees 10 crore and your expenses are only 5 crore, that means you have a 5 crore profit, right? Then what do? You cannot take it out. You have to invest it back in the school only. Maybe build infrastructure, make something new, but you cannot take it out and spend on yourself or give it to the investors. That is how education in India is run. That is, it is a not-for-profit sector. Now, many schools in India are facing issue with their fees. Ever since the right to education came up, schools have to reserve 25% seats for EWS. So they can't take fees from 25% students. Now, ideally, the government should have said that we will compensate this fee and we will give it to the schools. But that is not what happens. The government is not paying any money to the schools. So schools, in effect, can't take 25% of the fee. Now, what will the schools do? They would want to increase the fees for other students, right, to compensate. But because the parents protested, the government has imposed a control on the fee that the schools can take in many states. Thus, the financial health of the schools is not great. Now, you might argue that we should not aim for making profit in the schools. That is fine. But at the end of the day, you also have to understand that if the schools want to attract good teachers, teachers that would have been earning much more in some other place, if they have to come to the school has to attract them financially as well, which most of the schools cannot do. Not just this, recently the schools have also been discouraged from using private textbooks. In 2015, the HRD Ministry, which is now the Education Ministry, asked the schools to use only NCERT books which are published by the government. But the supply of these books also is a worry. Oxfam reported that in half of the schools that they surveyed in 2015 in 10 states, textbooks had not even arrived on time after the session had already begun. Yes, the NCERTs are improving their content, but they are still lagging as compared to their international counterparts. In fact, many other much better education systems in Asia are going in the opposite direction and allowing multiple textbook policy. China moved away from a national textbook policy in 1980s and encourages the use of multiple local textbooks to connect with real life interests and experiences of students in a modern society. India is still to make such changes. The reality is that we are pretty afraid of making any experiments in our education system. And if you see the framework of our education system, much of it has remained the same that it was in the past 30, 40, or 50 years, which needs to change. But it requires courage both at the end of the government to make it and at the end of the consumers who are receiving that education. These were the articles we wanted to discuss on the Hindu newspaper today. Now, a couple of practice questions. Number one, throw light on the significance of maintaining cordial relationships with the Middle East nations for India's economic development. Second, what are some of the issues faced by schools in villages and small towns of India? Suggest ways to overcome such issues. Both these questions have to be answered within 250 words each. Thank you so much for watching the video.